government message. So cheer up, you're it.
Hello YouTube, Mr. Faith in Physics here. I have about 10 minutes to try and break down the radiation threat. But before I dive into radiation, let me tell you about my brother. He was a nuclear power plant operator for many, many years. He learned it in the Navy. And no, he didn't die from radiation poisoning. But he did tell me the story of the time that his wife came to visit him at the plant and ended up setting all the detectors off. Unfortunately, she was on her way in to the plant. So after some researching, it turns out that one of her doctors had her on a medication that contained some radioactive isotopes, or more commonly referred to today as nuclides. So yes, there are sources of radiation that are all around us, and from sources we might not expect. Now, I don't think most people realize that not all radiation is created equally. And this is something that I find particularly disturbing, not making this clarification in the mainstream media. But their attorneys dictate just how far they can go. They don't want to get sued for starting a panic or anything, even if it's time to run like hell, which it isn't. But there are limits on what the media can do. Keep that in mind. Okay, so let's remember in geometry, the ray. It's a straight line path in one direction, usually depicted with an arrow on one end to show the direction of travel. Okay, now think of those straight lines as the sun's rays coming at us, from the sun in nice straight lines, but radiating out from the sun in all directions, like the spoke of a wheel. Overlooking the particle wave duality, this is pretty much radiation, and it comes from any source which emits energy packets or photons or particles like neutrons or alpha or beta particles. Now, when these radially ejected particles or photons by this material is what we call radioactivity. And a radioactive element is when an element like uranium that has absorbed at some time in the past extra energy or neutrons in its nucleus. So it wants to shed it off and return to a stable state and a lower number on the periodic table of elements. It sheds this energy when it spontaneously decays or spews out energy waves or actual little particles in order to reach that stable state where it will then cease to spontaneously eject particles and photons. So when a particle or energy packet is ejected from a radioactive material, it may be ejected in any direction and will then follow a straight line unless interacting with other particles or molecules, thereby deflecting its trajectory. Now, radiation comes in two distinct types: low energy and high energy. It's true that radiation is all around you all the time. Sunlight is radiation. So it's the heat that cooks your food, or even the heat that comes out of you. You're radioactive. But light and heat are not the bad guys that we're discussing in a nuclear disaster. Although anyone who's had a really bad sunburn and later suffered from skin melanomas might beg to differ with me on this. And this also points to the eventual damage that even so-called safe levels of radiation can cause. But it is the higher energy type that is our concern with the particles now reaching us from Japan. And I'll tell you why in a minute. Another short side note. I saw a program years ago that showed a 60-year-old Tibetan monk who had spent his entire life inside of these buildings, even though they were high altitudes and exposed to some gamma rays, but basically lived his entire life indoors. The guy looked like he was 30. I mean, his skin was just perfectly smooth. He just, he looked like he could have been more than 30, but he was 60. They also showed a Native American woman who lived on the plains and spent the majority of her life out in the sun. And she looked about 90. The effects of just years and years of solar radiation had aged her incredibly. I mean, she looked 90. Okay, now, back to radiation. Radiation shoots out in any direction, and if your body just happens to lie in its path, then this high energy radiation, and more specifically what we're worried about is ionizing radiation, is more likely to travel into or right through your body, knocking off pieces of molecules as it smashes into them. And if one of those molecules happens to be a DNA molecule, you could be in for some serious trouble, either now or down the road. Now, low energy radiation will most likely never even penetrate your skin, though if ingested, it can cause symptoms of mild poisoning. Now, high energy particles can do much more damage. The good news is that much of this damage can be repaired by the body, provided the assault is limited within a given time frame. Now, here is where it begins to get mushy. How sick you get, or what other symptoms of radiation poisoning you may experience, depends on how much, for how long, internally or externally, and really comes to a point where there simply is no clear answer. Now, as Dutch Sins has mentioned, any amount of this destructive ionizing radiation is not good. But the mathematics to calculate your increased risk for disease or death from Fukushima contaminants is daunting, to say the least, taking into account a great number of variables. However, one truth is blazingly clear. Your chances are higher than if those contaminants were not ejected into our environment at all. Now, as far as our ongoing threat from Japan, whatever airborne particles there may be are not in high enough concentrations now to trip off any major or sustained alarms, but watch for reports of tainted milk, since the cows tend to concentrate these particles in their milk as they ingest all those particles that have fallen onto the grass they eat or into the soil, which the grass takes up in its own nutrients. So check with your city to see if your water is being tested. Snow melt and runoff accumulate particles in your water supply, and continue doing so for the next 30 to 60 years. One might assume that because of the high atomic number of these radioactive materials in their tiny itty-bitty specks, would still be too heavy to go that far aloft on the air currents. But remember that heavy, very heavy objects like entire insects and seeds have been found to travel vast distances on the jet streams. Now, our next challenge will be in about 3 years when the jetsam and flotsam from the tsunami begin to wash up on our beaches. And with it, or not long behind it, the radioactive water.